Hey everybody, Nick Espinoza, your chief security fanatic here, and today I want to talk about a situation I'm calling Big Tech, the News, and the Battle for Australia. Now, this is actually really interesting. There's tons of sources on this. I'm cribbing from the New York Times, though, who had a really succinct article, but if you don't know what's going on now, for months, Facebook and Google have basically been locked into competition, essentially a stare down, as the New York Times put it, with news publishers and lawmakers in the country of Australia. Now, at the heart of this fight is basically whether tech giants should pay news organizations for the news articles that are shared on their networks. Under a proposed law from the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, both Google and Facebook would be required to negotiate with media publishers and compensate them for the content that appears on their site. Now, the Australian Competition and Consumer Commission, which is the country's top competition authority, has spent basically the past year drafting a bill for the Australian Parliament that would require Facebook and Google to negotiate with media publishers and then pay them for that content. The legislation includes a code of conduct that would allow media companies to bargain individually or collectively with digital platforms over the value of their news content. Now, Facebook and Google obviously have been fighting very hard to prevent this Australian law, which is expected to pass about this week or next week, from forcing their hands. But on Wednesday, yesterday, two companies, Facebook and Google, diverged on how they are essentially tackling this. Now, Google began yesterday by unveiling a 3-year global agreement with Rupert Murdoch's News Corp to pay for the publisher's news content. If you didn't know, Rupert Murdoch is from Australia and originally based there. But they are one of several such deals that it has announced recently where it appears to be effectively capitulating to the publisher's demand. So when the law passes, Google is sitting pretty. Hours later, though, Facebook decided no, they're not having it, and they took the opposite side and said they would restrict people and publishers from sharing or viewing news links in Australia, and they're going to do that effective immediately. Basically, if you're in Australia and you're trying to share a news article from a publisher, Facebook is going to shut you down. And if you are a publisher in Australia, basically with a Facebook page or a group or whatever to share this, they're going to shut you down too. Now, Facebook obviously struck a very different tone here than Google, basically just pulling the ripcord on everything. And to quote William Easton, the managing director of Facebook of Australia and New Zealand, they said basically about this legislation, and I quote, "The proposed law fundamentally misunderstands the relationship between our platform and publishers who share news content." Now, Facebook's decision on Wednesday was consistent with its past statements about just blocking links in Australia. They've been saying this for quite some time, and the move could basically make it difficult for Australians to basically access this stuff because publishers would no longer be able to share or post any content from their Facebook pages, and users would be unable to view news articles shared on Facebook by overseas publishers as well. Now, within Australia, Facebook's news ban so far has been kind of haphazard. It's been just kind of hit or miss. Some news pages were working, then others weren't, and now it's just been left and right. Some are getting error messages, but by 9 a.m. this morning, Sydney time, so I'm not even going to try to do the math on that off the top of my head here in Chicago, in Sydney, the impact was apparent and more wide-reaching than Facebook's original statements actually suggested. In addition to the news publishers being blocked, pages for things like Fire and Rescue New South Wales, the Bureau of Meteorology, and state police departments had all been essentially blocked or killed. Even state government pages with public health information about the COVID-19 pandemic were blocked, prompting, I guess, apparently an outrage from local officials and lawmakers, including one of the senators in Australia that is driving this, which is Sarah Hanson-Young. So this is absolutely going to be very interesting. But I also think it speaks to, and I've read multiple things about this, but I think it's absolutely right. It really speaks to the difference between Google and Facebook. Google is a search engine. Google is trying to bring you search results, trying to bring you news, trying to bring you websites, trying to get you into that filter bubble, obviously, so they can advertise to you while you're doing all of this for quote unquote free on their website. But Facebook, their mission, obviously free again, to data mine the bejesus out of you, but they are trying to give you a community with which you can basically talk with your friends, your peers, restrict that to just your friends, your peers, and Mark Zuckerberg, or the entire world. And so by virtue of that, they've taken an entirely different approach. Facebook always is beholden to the bottom line. Google has been as well. But in Google's case, this would hinder their ability, I think, to deliver results to their readers, to Australians. And therefore, if this is law in Australia, they're going to have to deal with this. Whereas Facebook basically says, no, we're just going to kill it. Too bad. Suck it up, Australians. We are not going to get your news from Facebook. Go to Google or somebody else. Now, I think this is actually really interesting because I think it's going to have a twofold issue. If Australia passes this law, and it looks like it will pass, Google has literally capitulated to this, though Facebook did not, we will probably see other countries making laws similar to this to say, hey, if Australia is getting paid, we want to get paid too. And I think that's something that we're going to have to contend with, as every country obviously has their own governing body, their own unique laws, their own publishing and distribution rights, and on and on and on. And conversely, it's going to be really interesting to see how this works, because if Facebook is drawing a hard line, what happens to smaller social media platforms that weren't included in the Google-Facebook mashup? Twitter is still a major platform, even though there's hundreds of millions of people that use Twitter, not billions like Facebook and Google, not to mention LinkedIn and other places where you can share news. What are they going to look like? And then even the smaller, more fringe social media ones, like the Parlors of the world that are technically global as well, what's going to happen there? Are they going to have to pay? And by virtue of that, are they simply going to say, no, we're going to block it too? What does that look like for the world? Part of the benefit of having a social media platform like a Facebook, despite my problems with it for data mining and privacy and everything else, is that it is a very easy way to communicate news and information. The downside obviously being false information, disinformation, and all of that. And people tend to believe their crazy uncle's conspiracy theories when he posts them over a legitimate news source, especially if you are drinking your uncle's Kool-Aid kind of thing. So I think this is going to be a very interesting test of what we are seeing going on here. But Google is going to pay. Facebook is not. And I think the future, when it comes to compensating publishers that are proliferating their articles on various platforms, I think that's going to be in doubt, and we're going to see what that does in terms of shaping the news as well. And that is your news of the day. And please like, share, follow me here on Facebook and Twitter at NickAESP. And please feel free to subscribe to me at YouTube as well. And as always, stay safe and stay online. And keep reading Australia. Thanks, guys.